Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with astronomer Hugh Ross. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
We're going to be talking about a common question that we receive, not only from Christians, but non-Christians alike. And is it possible for Noah's flood to really cover the entire earth?
It's not scientifically possible, and it's biblically impossible. The Bible does not teach that the flood was global. It explicitly tells us it was less than global. Passages like 2 Peter 2:5 says that it covered the world of ungodly people. There was no ungodly people at that time living in Antarctica, so there's no need for God to extend the flood. But probably the most explicit texts would be the ones we see in the wisdom books, Job and Psalms and Proverbs. Psalm 104, the longest of the creation psalms, takes you through much of the content of the 6 days. When it addresses creation day 3, it talks about God transforming earth from a water world to where there's oceans and continents coexisting. That's verses 6, 7, and 8. And it says, once the continents are in place, verse 9, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. So that's a text that explicitly tells us the flood of Noah wiped out the entire world of ungodly people and all the animals associated with them, but it was not a global event.
So then what you're saying, talking about the verses in Psalm, that this happened prior to Noah's flood, and it says, never again shall these waters cover the entire earth.
Yeah, creation day 3 talks about when earth was water over the whole surface and let the land masses appear. And that gets repeated again in Job 38, Proverbs 8, and Psalm 104. And in Psalm 104, it talks about how once these continents are in place, they have a permanent barrier. Never again will water cover the face of the earth. Job 38 likewise says that they have a permanent barrier to the waters.
So what I love about this perspective is that it forces us to look through the entirety of Scripture to really find a deeper understanding of what events like Noah's flood meant and the extent, for example, of the flood. So if the flood wasn't global in the sense that it didn't cover the entire earth, but it did cover all of humanity during that time.
All the locations where humanity lived.
Right. So then what was the extent of the flood?
Well, we know from Genesis that God scattered humanity from one locale to all the places over the land masses. That's Genesis chapter 10 and 11, and the flood is previous to that. And notice we have God commanding Adam and Eve, multiply and fill the earth. They didn't do it. The reason why we know God repeated the command to Noah and his sons, multiply and fill the earth, they didn't do it either. God had to forcibly scatter humanity over the face of the earth. And we actually have DNA evidence that tells us that humanity was in one locale and then quickly covered all the other continental land masses, with the exception of Antarctica.
So then humanity was not fulfilling God's call to, fill the earth and be fruitful and multiply, essentially. So then after the flood event and after humanity gets scattered, then that's when it happened.
Right. We knew at a minimum it had to cover all the Mesopotamian plains because of the geographical place names we see mentioned. It also talks about the land of Nod, which we know is in southern Iran. So it had to cover that area. And it tells us in Genesis 8 that it took 7.5 months for the flood waters to recede, which means there had to be an extensive amount of melting snow and ice to replace the water that's flowing out into the Indian Ocean. So it tells me this has happened during the last ice age, which means the Persian Gulf would have been mostly dry land. So I think it's about 1 million square miles. I actually put a map in my book, Navigating Genesis, showing the probable extent of the flood at the time of Noah. And it's about 4 times bigger than what you see in most old Earth interpretations of the flood, because we put the date during the last ice age.
So what does the scientific data say? Is there any sort of evidence, geological records that show that there was a significant flood?
What's interesting is we find flood layers in the Mesopotamian plain, but they're not the flood of Noah. And wouldn't expect to find any because the flood only lasted 13 months. In order to leave a significant flood deposit, we would need to have a certain kind of geological event And to give you an example, there was a 50-foot flood that covered a huge area of Mississippi just 30 years ago, and it lasted for 4 months. There's zero evidence of that today. We're only talking, 30 years. Whereas in the case of the flood, we're having to go back thousands of years. So it's no surprise we have no scientific evidence.
So there's no scientific evidence that there was a significant flood.
Well, we can't rule out that there was
Right.
scientific evidence for it, because you wouldn't expect to find
Right.
evidence given the locale and the duration of the flood.
What would we expect if there were a global flood? Would there be scientific evidence?
There definitely would be.
So what would that look like? And do we see that?
Well, for example, you would have to have the mountains pushed up a huge amount. You would need plate tectonics of a dramatic amount. We would need to see evidence of significant changes in the laws of physics. And we don't see that in the measurements of the Earth or the universe. In astronomy, we can look back in time and see what's happened to the laws of physics. We see no change. And there's a biblical reason. The Bible tells us that the laws that govern the universe and the Earth do not change. And so that rules out anything of such a catastrophic nature that it would actually cover all the land masses on planet Earth with water. Moreover, I've talked about this in Navigating Genesis. A big problem with the global flood model, it doesn't permit the existence of life. And it tells us in the text that Noah and his family and their animals survived the event.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that. It's certainly a deep topic. If you'd like to hear more on this topic, go to shop.reasons.org and search for Hugh's book, Navigating Genesis.